for having me. This is a really stimulating event, and there have been some great talks. I've been pretty moved so far. I have a planet too. There's 7 billion people and countless species that call this place home. Over the last couple of decades, it's become more and more obvious that we're altering many of Earth's ecosystems in a dramatic and sometimes irreversible way. Now, there's many aspects to this, but what I'd like to focus on for this talk is sustainability through the lens of our addiction to fossil fuels. Now, I believe that this is an existential crisis with no parallel in human history. But I also believe that there's still time to act if we act quickly enough. I'd also like to talk about a solution that I think is both vital and achievable. But before we get to that, I would like to talk about the problem, just to see where we're coming from. Now, over the last million years or so, the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has gone up and down. There's also been massive changes in temperature, and that's matched that up and down fluctuation of the carbon dioxide, as you can see from this graph here, very accurately. And since we've been burning fossil fuels in the last 160 years or so, that concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has actually increased an awful lot in our lifetimes. And this is where we are now, which is the highest level we've been in millions of years. And if we carry on going at the same rate for another 40 years, this is where we'll be at. Now, it's inevitable that the temperature will rise to match this level of carbon dioxide, but the questions remain: how high will that temperature go and how fast? Well, with business as usual for the rest of the century, it's likely that we're going to be on track for perhaps a global temperature rise of maybe 5 degrees or even more. And that's much greater than the maximum 2 degrees that we've agreed to internationally. Now, 5 degrees may not sound like a great amount, but it's about the same temperature difference as between now and the last ice age. And just to give you a sense of how cold it was, back in the last ice age, what we now know as New York was covered by a layer of ice that was nearly 2 kilometres thick. So what are some of the impacts that we can expect to see from this?
That's the sound of how urgent this issue is, Stephen.
Yeah, this is a real climate emergency. So one thing that we can expect to see is a really huge increase in the number of extremely hot days. Over this century alone, we may see by the end of the century over half the days of the year in a state of almost permanent, unimaginable heat over most of Australia. And to me, it's not really clear that we can adapt to that easily. More broadly, it's fair to say that the risks of raising the global temperature to the top of this chart are likely to combine in such a way that what we know as modern civilization would be under grave threat. Even a 2-degree limit would not be safe. And also just consider raising the temperature just a single degree could cut wheat yields by up to 25% through heat stress alone. And that's before we even consider things like pests and diseases that are going to thrive in hotter, moister climates. And as bad as all that is, things could actually be even worse. Unfortunately, a lot of our climate models tend to underestimate some of the important self-reinforcing feedback effects, such as those that have been playing out in the Arctic region with the disappearance of the summer sea ice. So these are all the models, and this is actually what's happening in reality. So Earth seems to be worryingly decades ahead of some of our best predictions. Now, all that CO2 in the atmosphere isn't just raising the temperature of the Earth and having all those impacts. It's also changing the very chemistry of our oceans. And I've got a very simple experiment here I'd like to demonstrate. Here we have two identical glasses of water that I've added some pH indicator to. And what I'm going to do is combine some carbon dioxide with one of these glasses of water from my breath using this straw, so you can see what happens. Sorry for the mess.
Impressive.
And I hope you can see clearly that the colour of this has changed. And what this indicates is that when we add carbon dioxide to water, it actually acidifies the water. And this is exactly what we're seeing in the real world too. In fact, a recent study found that our oceans are acidifying at a rate without equal in the last 300 million years, which to me is just absolutely astounding. So it's clear that we have a choice as humanity and as a society. We can either clean up our act really quickly or we can head to really bad things. And just to give you an idea of what acidification has as an effect on, say, corals, these are two identical plates that were buried on the seafloor off Papua New Guinea for about a year. And they were placed in very, very similar locations, only a couple of 100 metres apart. The only difference is that the one on the right was placed near a natural CO2 vent, where the acidity of the water is what we think scientists think are going to simulate to be the kind of conditions that are around before the end of the century. As you can see, the plate that was in the acidic conditions didn't survive so well. And that's before you include the extra effects of temperature and oxygen loss, which are also happening. So, assuming that we decide to do something to clean up our act and do something urgently, what is something that we can do that will have a real impact? Well, for my money, this I think is a really great idea. Having a zero carbon electricity system would make a big difference, because electricity is our biggest source of emissions. I should also say that the ACT government is leading the way. It has a remarkable target of 90% renewables by 2020. But I think nationwide, if we pull out all the stops, we could probably get close to 100% by 2030. And the kinds of systems that feed into a 100% renewable grid include variable sources and flexible sources. So the variable sources, we know they're wind and solar, and the flexible sources are things like hydroelectric and solar thermal. And the big difference between these types of sources is that the flexible sources actually store a huge amount of energy. And what that enables them to do is to dispatch electricity into the grid when we need it the most. I'm also a real firm believer that communities can take leading action on this transformation. In the ACT, we've created an organisation called SolarShare, and what we're doing there is we're enabling members of the local community to invest in local solar farms. And the way it works is that the local solar farms generate electricity, sell that to the grid, and the profits from the sale of that electricity go back to the investors. And you can join SolarShare for as little as $350. We've had hundreds of people who are potential investors contact us, and we've got some really great interest in this. We're just about to launch our first project, which is here. It's a 5,000 panel solar farm, which will generate enough electricity for the equivalent of about 250 homes. And one of the really great things about this project as a whole is that if it's successful, and there's every reason to hope it is, what we intend to do is to create like an open source blueprint of how we've done all this, so that other groups around the country can take what we've done, adapt it to their areas, hopefully even improve on it. And that way they can do this without having to reinvent the wheel. And just finally, I'd like to say that I really also believe that wealth doesn't have to be about how much stuff you own. I think that we can live very prosperous, healthy, and happy lives if we decide to choose to live more ethically and sustainably. Thank you.